Good evening, friends. Glad you're listening or viewing tonight. Welcome to the podcast Wounded Hearts, Wounded Churches. Topics we discuss include sexual addiction, religious abuse, and religious disenfranchisement, and other types of addiction. This live platform offers counseling sessions, meaningful question and answer, and a counseling continuum. The team includes Personnel Director Lolita Williams, our LPN, Linda Holmes, Technical Director, Ms. Tennille, and our visiting K-Class, Larry Brown and Ray Edwards. And my name is Prince, licensed counselor and founder of Antioch Youth Center 5013C program here. The views and opinions, friends, expressed on the podcast may not reflect the thoughts, ideas of Wounded Heart staff. Be advised, these sensitive content will elicit on your part some viewer and listener discretion. Our focus is implementing three things, friends. We're here to try to elicit, implement, and encourage three things: forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing within the Church of God. So thanks for being here for this process. We can do all our part to see that done and have God bless and help us to move on. One introduced our guests tonight, and of course, our main guest we have as our listeners and our viewers. If you want to take part, you can. You can go to YouTube and type in Church of God in Macon, Georgia. You'll see the live Wounded Hearts broadcast, number 16. You can just enter in on that chat. Also, our special guest, very special guest, is Tabitha Edwards Ward, Church of God child. She's a mom. She's earned 2 bachelor's degrees, and she's an accountant. Sister Ward, if people want to contact you for help or support, how can they best do that?
The best way would be via my email, which is tabithadward@gmail.com. And that's TABITHADWARD@gmail.com.
Appreciate that so much. Listen, I want to again thank our listeners for listening and viewing. Our average listening during the week is 150 people. We've been up to 800, and we thank God for that. I had a pastor call me say, Moon, Pastor, I had not fellowshipped in 30 years, called me, and now we're discussing things, writing letters because of the broadcast. Also, 2 other groups I've been in contact with, they're reconsidering getting back together. So we're glad about that, to see people reconnected, forgiving, healing in God's church. So thank you so much for that. Friends, this discussion about losing a whole generation affects me, really does. When I was a child, I was in church. Director, can we run these clips we have?
Sure.
And here's some pictures of the church that I used to attend as a child. They had a big Boy Scout group. They had a Girl Scout group and young people's activities. And I mean, it was jam-packed with people. Thanks so much for that. But now, if you go back to that same church, you might see 15 or 20 young people. So, friends, we're losing a generation, and we want to do all we can to try to reconnect with those. Many have been hurt, wounded, and some have just been so deeply hurt they don't know what to do. So we want to reach out and help those who want help. We have Sister Ward here, like again, Church of God child, and we're going to ask her about her experience. Sister Ward, let's go back about 20 years. You were young. Well, you're young now, but you were younger then.
Yes.
What were some of the signs that there was problems in the church?
I think I was around 14 when the big, huge split occurred. But probably around 10 or 11, there was moments where even though I wasn't quite certain what I was seeing or what I was viewing, there was something that in an 11-year-old child's mind just didn't sit right. And when you grow up and everything's about God and you see things and you're like, what is that about? It starts bringing up moments that you're like, okay, what is this? What's going on? But you can't really place it because, in your mind, your exposure has only been via the church. So you always choose to look at it and think it's okay. It's happening in the church. But probably around 11 was when I started seeing things that just didn't make sense in my little mind. And I remember the biggest and probably most impactful moment was God was talking to me, and I firmly believe, and I know for a fact he was. And I remember he had pricked my heart, and it was like, okay, you're at the point where you need to make a decision. Are you going to follow God, or are you going to just stay as you are and get past the age of innocence and make choices for yourself. And I remember speaking with the pastor's wife, and I said, I need to say the prayer to ask God into my heart. And I wasn't really certain at the moment what that was. I just knew I needed to let God know that He was first and foremost. And I remember the conversation going, this isn't word for word, but it was more along the lines of, well, do you think you've sinned? Well, I mean, at the time, I did not feel like I had. I was 11, I obeyed my parents and did what I could. And if I stepped out, I would get disciplined. But I didn't think I had sinned, but I just knew I needed God. And the response was kind of, well, if you've never sinned, then you're okay. And I think that's the first time I ever took a step back, even though I was young, and was like, wait a second, that's weird. So that would probably be the first impact. And then there was just things you would see that didn't really add up to your mind because you were taught that things were supposed to be godly and holy. And there was actions of people who were in a ministry position or a position where behaviors didn't really reflect what you thought that had been impressed upon you as holy and godly. And so it was just a progression. And then, like I said, at the age of 14, is when our family was no longer involved in the church in a full capacity like that.
So you mentioned behaviors from the ministry. When that occurred, a child knows
Yes.
right from wrong, don't they? They
Yes.
can sense it. Is that true?
Yes, it very much so. And even though now that I'm older and I can look back on it, I know what I was seeing and I understand it in full capacity. But as a child, I mean, my parents were involved in the church before I was born. So I was born into the church. The only life I knew was the church. So I was very sheltered in that aspect. And there was a lot of things that I had no clue what they were that I was seeing, but it didn't feel right. Like it didn't look right. And it gave you that, for lack of better words, that ick feeling inside. You're like, that's weird. That's odd. And as a child, there's an innocence there that right from wrong. And when it stirs you, when you see something, even if you don't really understand what it is, 100%.
Director, any comments or questions coming in on your end?
Not at this time, sir, no.
Tabitha, that was a blessing that God spoke to you during that time. That was a real blessing that He was able to deal with your heart at that young age.
Yes. It was.
I'm sorry.
It was. No, it was very much so.
And of course, the person, for whatever reason, was not equipped to give you good counsel.
Right.
And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. How did these problems affect childhood relationships, your friendships with other children? How did that affect your friendship with your other friends in the church?
My other friends. That's a very deep conversation we can get into in regards to that. Being that I grew up wholly in the church, completely, totally, wholly being in totality, all of my friends were associated with the church. I did go to public school 1 year, which was my first grade year. We didn't have kindergarten, mandatory back then. So that was my only outside interaction, was my first grade. After that, we went to church at the church school. So my friends were people we went to church with, who I hung out with, what we did, any extracurricular things. It was all based around church friends. It was the church, that was my life. When the incident happened and our family was told we were no longer allowed to go there, I was old enough that I was like, okay, this is weird. But at the same time, in one swift moment, my entire friendship base, life, everything ceased to exist, in the sense of, I remember calling certain friends and like, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to talk to you anymore. And at the time it didn't make sense because, we had grown up being told God's love and everything is supposed to point back to Him. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, wait a second. These are people I've known since I was born. What did I do personally that's causing them to turn their backs on me. And at 14 years old, friends are pretty important, because it was at the time you could get your driver's license. At 15, I was almost at that age, and we had friends and sleepovers, and we had discussed what we were going to do when we would have our driver's license. And in one moment, with 10 or less words from a pulpit, everything ceased to exist. I was no longer allowed to go back to school. I was no longer to talk to any friends, period. And at that age, it was hard not to get very mad and bitter and confused. I remember just thinking, it brought in so much self-doubt and self-wonderment of, what did I do? What did I do to cause this? Because, as a 14-year-old, that's kind of where your mind goes. What did I do? Not understanding that there's a much bigger picture that came as I've gotten older and dealt with things. But it definitely was pretty devastating as a 14-year-old to have everything just completely ripped from you in one night.
Well, I mean, I just can't comprehend how you went through that. I mean, as a 14-year-old, you were put out of school.
Yes.
Your friendship base, your network was taken from you.
Everybody, yes.
Tell me more about those feelings. I mean, I just can't. I just can't. It's astounding. It's astounding. Really, it's astounding.
It was very hard. I remember I did have a younger brother, thankfully. So it was like, okay, well, we're kind of going through this together, in the sense all of his friends he could no longer talk to. So it was kind of like we had this little bond. We were in this group. Thankfully, not thankfully, unfortunately, that's probably the better word. There was two or three other families that, because they chose to still associate with us, they were put out. So we kind of had this group of about 5 kids who we were all bonding. We weren't allowed to speak to any of our friends that we had grown up with. We weren't allowed to see anyone. And it was devastating. And me personally, it made me question my worth as a person, because, like I said, at 14, 15, you think anything that happens is because of you. You're still in that, it's all about me phase.
Sure. And
it really did. It took years for me to get to the point where I didn't still look at that and be like, okay, that was something I did, because it was easy to associate that with, then, okay, well, they said they did this because of God. So then you look and you're like, but it causes a conflict when it comes to speaking of God, because God's love and God's compassionate and God is forgiving. But then here, people completely destroyed your 14-year-old life in the name of God. But yet, on the other hand, it was, but God is this. So it caused a huge conflict for me personally. And thankfully, my parents never completely turned away from God. So they still kept God focused in our life. But at 14, it was hard for me to even want to talk about God, think about God, go forward, because it was just, my life as I knew it had ended. And I was at the age where it wasn't like you could just, okay, you're 5 years old, let's start again. Not saying that it doesn't affect children that are younger than 5, not saying that, but it was, at that age, it's not easy to make friends once you hit 15 and you're in, high school. Sure. It's harder when you've had just kind of like a built-in friendship for the last 14 years. And mentally, that was probably the hardest thing, is the mental toll it took. And it took me years, I think, to delve into all of it, to see what exactly, because it impacted, even as I've gotten older, how I formed bonds with people, because it's like, well, how long do I know they're going to be? What if something happens? What if it just ends? What are you going to do if you've invested all this time? So it caused issues that were longer lasting than just that moment in time. And it took a while to get where I realized it wasn't me. It was a spirit that had taken over an environment, and that wasn't God, that was a spirit that had came in. But at that time it was hard to see through it was hard to see through the forest, because at that moment that's all I saw.
When you would see friends who were told not to talk to you, how do you think they were affected with that? Those who you had to break up friendships with?
There are some friendships that never truly recovered. I will say this, I'll try to say it without becoming emotional because it really touched my heart. There was a friend that I had that we had spent the night at each other's house. We were really good friends. And she was one that I had spoken with and had called, and her dad had basically said, look, you can't talk to her anymore. And I remember on the phone, she was like, okay, I'm not allowed to talk to you anymore. I'm sorry. And she hung up. Mm. And actually, probably 6 months ago, maybe give or take, she and I were in contact again, and we were sitting and talking, and it was a good conversation, and it was nice to reconnect because, this was 14 years of my childhood. And she looked at me and she said, I wanted to apologize to you for what I did when we were younger. And it had never crossed my mind again, as I have dealt with it and put it to rest. I never really, the issues I had were never with the kids, because we were taught to obey our parents, listen to our parents, no questions asked. So I had rationalized that whatever actions we took was based upon what our parents told us to do. And she apologized, and I just looked at her and I was like, it touched my heart, because it was like, wow. And it felt so freeing in the sense of, obviously it impacted her more than I even realized it impacted her, because here she is, we're building a friendship, we've been friends, and and she talked about that. She said it was one of the hardest things she did, because just instantly someone that had been in her life for 14 years you couldn't talk to. And there are other friends that I would call my BFFs. Some of us have reconnected. We don't have that bond that we used to, because there's still that slight worry or distrust, and they stayed in the church, and then they've also dealt with other issues that ended up a bigger division. But you never truly get back to that innocence and that bond that you had, and it causes you to question things. Like I said, as you build relationships, you're like, okay, is this one going to end if something happens and they don't like it, or you have to deal with that. And it takes a while to, as I say, it's an onion, and you peel it back periodically.
So you didn't charge it to her because you just obeying her parents.
Right. I mean, because we were taught you obey your parents or you're being disrespectful, and disrespectful was not something we did, because that's God. That was a disservice to God, and that was disrespectful to God. So you respected your parents, period.
To our director, any questions?
Yes, I have a question from Prince Damascus. He asked, you said you realized it wasn't your fault. Where did that start?
Good question.
That's a very loaded question. I was probably 26, 27 before I truly came to the point that it was like, okay, that was not me. It took lots of therapy. I mean, I'm a firm believer in therapy, lots of prayers, lots of reading the Bible, more therapy. And between all of that, you come to the realization you can understand things that your 14-year-old mind isn't fully able to process. But it was around the age 26, probably 25 and a half, 26. I was fully able to say, okay, I can step back from this. I can see it as it was. That's not saying I was at peace with everything, but it was to the point that I was able to say, okay, that wasn't my fault. That was a spirit that had entered the church. And it took the therapist. She's like, okay, well, why do you think, thank God she was a biblical based therapist. So when she presented things, we always pointed it back to God. So it was like, okay, well, why do you think? And so she was able to help me peel back the layers and get to a point where I was like, okay, it wasn't me that did this. It was a spirit had entered into an environment, and that's what led to the cutting off of people and the discommunication and the not talking, and the parents were just following what was preached to them from the pulpit, and in return it trickled down to the kids. And that wasn't, even when we were removed from the church, that wasn't on me either. And I'm not saying it's my parents by any chance, don't get that, but that's how it was. That's the environment that we were brought up in. So it wasn't my fault. I had to follow my parents. That was the path that God put us on. So we had to just move along and find out where he wanted us.
Yeah.
Another question?
I do. I have a few more after this as well, Tabitha.
You're good.
Mrs. DA313 asked, did you ever see them when you left the church?
There was a few moments, not a few moments, but a few instances. Our town isn't really that big. I mean, it's a college town, but we would see each other. It was always unsettling, is the best way to explain it. I can remember there would be times, I remember one specifically, we were in the library, and our library wasn't very big, but my mom was big on us reading and checking out books, and someone that my brother was actually really good friends with and his mother were there. They saw us, turned around, walked out of the library. And I remember thinking, well, what did we do? Because it was just my brother and I that she saw. And then she saw my mom. And I remember times being at the grocery store and people would be coming down the aisle towards us. They would see us and they would turn around and walk away. As a child, it was devastating. I mean, I'm gonna be honest. It was like, okay, well, we're not there anymore. So, you're supposed to love on sinners. If you believe I'm a sinner, why aren't you loving on me?
Sure.
It was hard. Now, like I said, there are friends that now I see some of them quite regularly. And we're I would say some of them are good friends, but we're not back to that place pre-separation.
Another question.
Yes. Carrie Ann asks, Tabitha, did you feel God had failed you? Interesting question.
Good question.
Until I was about 20, I did. Until I was about 20. And what happened at 20 was I made the choice to get back to search God out, because I never truly felt like my life was full because I did not have God in it, because I always felt that pull towards God. And I felt like my life would be full with God. It took me until I was 19 or 20. It was my freshman year of college, the end of my freshman year of college. And I started visiting churches. And I'm like, okay, God, talk to me. Tell me what's going on, because I don't like this ick feeling I have whenever someone brings up God. I know you exist because I've seen you work in ways that can only be described as you. But it took me about 6 years to fully get back to where I wasn't placing any blame on him. And I was leaning more towards learning and building a relationship with God, because it was hard when everything is done to you and your family in the name of God, and it doesn't coincide with the God you see in the Bible. It's hard to reconcile that, especially as you're a kid and then you're growing up and then you're going to college. But I finished my freshman year, I got married, and then I knew there was more. I knew there was more, and I had to figure out what it was. And I knew that to do that, I had to get back to the basics with God and move forward.
Any other questions?
No, that's enough. That's all we have for now.
Well, our time is gone. Time is gone. So we got to have you come back next week.
Okay,
Friends, we're talking about the difficult part, but we want to share with you also how God brought her through that. So in other words, if you've been wounded by church activities, and someone who's listening tonight, you're able to get past that and go on to serve God like Sister Edwards did. Friends, this podcast is by Church of God for Church of God. We've all been affected to some effect some level with these divisions have been going on since day one.
Very true.
And so we can all do our part to find ways to implement and sustain reconciliation, forgiveness, and healing. And that would be better for our children, grandchildren. And so we want to do all we can to do our part in putting forth this agenda. And again, these situations can be sensitive, but they're common. They're very common, unfortunately. I mentioned to you last week about Rudyard Kipling. He's an author, British born. They wanted to knight him, but he wouldn't take that knighthood. Twice they tried to do it, but he wanted to be an author. I think his most poignant statement was, "It's not settled till it's settled." So we're trying to reach out to seek those who've been through these situations and how God has brought them out and healed them and caused them to forgive and reconcile and to pass that on. So we want to thank Mr. Edwards tonight for being here, our team, Linda Holmes, Olita Williams, our director, Tennille, and we're just thanking that you're here to help us out, and we thank you so much. So next week, hear the positive part of how God brought her through that and what you're doing even today. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Lord bless you.
Amen.
Amen.